rise of China is reshaping the world. What was a starving nation, ravaged by civil war and revolution, has become a global superpower.
The hunger for a better life was so huge that they were willing to take enormous risks and make enormous sacrifices.
The whole atmosphere at that time was this kind of hope.
They try to erase the history, erase human memories, so Chinese people cannot know their own past.
China is a haunted house. There were all these weeping ghosts in the air from all these past tragedies and disasters.
There's a perfect marriage of communism and capitalism when they matched together and created something wow.
China is not good at soft power. There's plenty of hard power. But in terms of soft power, not so good.
This is exactly why the government cannot have this generation in their pockets, because they don't understand us at all.
The only way that you can say that a return to the motherland is natural is to completely disregard history.
The rise of China didn't happen overnight. Its roots reach deep into the past. And if we want to understand what's happening now, we need to dig down into the foundations of the China century. It is hard to overstate the economic revolution that China has accomplished in less than a human lifetime. We've become so familiar with China as an economic giant, it's easy to forget how unlikely its transformation actually was, and just how many obstacles the Chinese people faced when all of this began, in the chaos brought on by the death of Mao Zedong.
Leaders of the party and the state, and over 50,000 workers, peasants, and soldiers, and people from other circles in the capital, with most profound proletarian feelings, arrive at the magnificent Great Hall of the People to mourn the great leader and teacher, Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao's face, firm and serene. Although trying to restrain their bitter grief, they weep as they slowly file past to pay their respects to their most respected and beloved leader, Chairman Mao.
It was a promise. It was a promise of communism. And we all will live equally and have happy life. When Mao died, the whole thing cannot hold on anymore. It fell into parts. And within the party and within the community and the economy is going down, and you realize the promise was actually a lie.
The death of Mao in 1976 laid bare the failure of his revolution. The Great Leap Forward, Mao's campaign for socialist economic transformation, launched in 1958, had failed disastrously and produced a famine that killed up to 45 million people.
The Great Leap Forward really was one man's idea. Chairman Mao's half-baked idea to turn China into a modern power. But Mao himself had no training in economics. So what he did was purely a political campaign. One industry that really was at core of that whole plan was steel industry. But there was no well thought out plans in terms of how to train skilled workers, to develop the industry. All they did was mobilize the entire nation to throw things into furnaces. You had like frying pans in your home, you would throw your pans into the furnaces. All those farmers left their farmlands because they were all forced to do steel work. Mountains were stripped bare of trees for fuel. There's no agriculture production. So millions of people died as a result of that, of starvation.
Mao silenced his political opponents and critics of the Great Leap Forward with an ideological purge he called the Cultural Revolution, a violent, anti-capitalist crusade that only ended with his death.
China, in per capita terms of income per capita, was poorer in 1976, the year that Chairman Mao died, than it had been pretty much at any time in the preceding 1,000 years. That really is the start of the China rise story, the globalizing China story. It started in abject poverty for millions and millions of people.
Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, returned from political exile to take the mantle of power. He was out of Mao's shadow now, but he shouldered an incredible burden.
Deng Xiaoping himself survived the cruelty of the Cultural Revolution. And, he was a reformer. Can't imagine the kind of pressure that was on him, right? Basically trying to save the whole country from starvation.
So great was Deng Xiaoping's desperation, he looked to China's two worst enemies for help: capitalism and Japan.
Mr. Deng's historic visit, the first by a leader from the People's Republic of China, prompted some of the tightest security precautions ever seen here. Hundreds of right-wing activists have opposed the visit. Their sometimes dramatic protests against Japan's closer ties with China have included an attempted ritual disembowelment by one uniformed ultra-rightist. Mr. Deng's arrival symbolized the post-war reconciliation of Asia's most populous nation and its leading economic power.
Most people, when they look at China's coming out into the world economically, look at the US, they look at Deng's trip there, they look at his time at the rodeo with the 10-gallon hat on his head, and that's the main image that comes away from that period. But I would argue his trip to Japan is equally important for a number of reasons. At that time, Japan was catching up on the West with enormous velocity. They were the cutting edge in manufacturing, they were the cutting edge in electronics, in transport, fast trains and the like. But not only that, and I think this is the most important part of it, this was not just a model of modernization or development, it was an Asian model of modernization and development. And for China, this showed that there was an alternative to the West, which could create wealth and compete with the West.
At the Nissan car plant south of Tokyo, Deng was treated to a tour of the factory floor, where the company had recently added robots to its production line.
At the time, I think the Nissan factory was making about 100 cars a day, and Deng, on hearing this figure, sort of quipped, well, that's about 100 more than we managed to make. One of my favourite images from that trip is when Deng catches the Shinkansen, I think, down to Osaka. He's wearing the sort of Mao suit. Chinese trains at that time were backward. They were usually used to transport coal. Here he comes to Japan, He's like a giddy little schoolboy on this fast train.
怎么样？这个乘新干线以后有什么想法？
就感觉到快。
Deng returned to Beijing inspired. Forget ideology and class struggle. The new revolution was economic development. He launched a program of market reform, starting with the socialist commune system, under which farmers grew only a set quota of produce for distribution by the government.
They began with allowing farmers to sell on the open market some of the produce that they produced, rather than under the previous commune system to simply hand over their produce that they produced to the authorities. You had farmers growing the crops increasingly that they wanted to grow because they felt that they could sell those agricultural produce on the free market. And when the authorities in Beijing saw the results of this experiment, they were amazed.
Farming productivity took off. Between 1978 and 1984, China's annual grain harvest grew by 100 million tons. For the first time in decades, there was enough food to feed the nation. In the cities, the pace of reform was slower. Most workers were employed in state-owned enterprises, where your wages were fixed, but your job was guaranteed for life. The so-called iron rice bowl.
I served the army for 3 years. And if you serve the army, and when you come back, you will be offered a job. So after 3 years, I came back, and I offered the job on the railway. So it was kind of a privilege, more than a privilege, because that was a huge state-owned enterprise. The railway is an iron rice bowl, so you don't really lose it. Railway worker, wow, that's who you are, a privilege.
Among those unable to find work in state units, the bold began to take their chances in the back alleys of market reform.
By the mid-1980s, you were beginning to see the first private entrepreneurs. And many of these guys, famous guys now, multi-billionaires, people like Liu Yonghao, who I think is ranked the 19th richest person in China, multi-billionaire, started his entrepreneurial career by selling quail's eggs on the street. The essential nature of the economic reforms that Deng began was really a mixture of blind eye turning from the top and a huge amount of creative disobedience among what would become China's entrepreneurial class. This was really a case of entrepreneurial vigor and spirit being unleashed into any area that wasn't expressly forbidden by the central government.
Reform was one half of Deng's recipe for development. The other was opening up to foreign trade and investment. The main vehicle for doing that was a Chinese innovation, the Special Economic Zone. The first of them in the southern city of Shenzhen, neighboring Hong Kong.
For most of the 35 years since the Communist Revolution, slogans and banners have proclaimed the glories of the revolution. Ideology has come before expertise. But in the new China trying to modernize, it's more important to be expert rather than read. So here in the economic showpiece called Shenzhen, a slogan proclaims, "Time is money, efficiency is life."
Shenzhen is different from the rest of China. special incentives, reduced tax on profits, exemption from import duties, and the right to hire and fire have lured businessmen from Hong Kong, Japan, America, and Australia.
Foreign investment was crucial. It helped China get much desired technology, capital, and other resources that China really needed to develop the economy. And then they would sell all those things that were made in China to other parts of the world. That basically was the start of how China became the world's factory floor.
In 1984, China's economy grew by 15%, thanks in large part to Shenzhen, which grew by 85%. The average worker in Shenzhen earned 3 or more times as much as someone doing the same job outside of the special economic zone. But the big winners weren't sewing teddies on the factory floor. A new managerial class was emerging, often with privileged connections to the ruling elite.
Mr. Wu earns $10,000 a year, and his family enjoy all mod cons, including the luxury of running water, an inside toilet, and imported electrical appliances. He's the local Communist Party secretary, who this year received a visit from China's preeminent leader, Deng Xiaoping. When Deng learnt about Mr. Wu's family income, he exclaimed, "That's more than I get."
Corruption was a problem from very early on, because after signing off on those special economic zones, Deng Xiaoping also encouraged the townships, the counties all over the country to start companies and contracted the management of those companies out to local party officials to gain some market experiences. There was a lot of abuse of power and also a lot of conflict of interest in setting up those businesses. You know, the local officials might have favored business people who bribed them.
That was the beginning part, giving the managers more power to squeeze the workers. Even just a bottle of alcohol. If you can give a bottle to the manager, you will get better treatment. And even you make mistakes, and you will get salary adjustment. We're all human. We were taught in school that we supposed, to build communism. We should forget ourselves. But when we are entering to that actual system, we forget everything else but ourselves.
In the new China, Deng Xiaoping said some would get rich before others. In capitalist economies, that principle is both the driver of growth and the main source of social conflict. So, could China's leadership have one without the other? In 1989, in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, they would find out. In April 1989, thousands of students took to the streets of Beijing in protest. In the West, these demonstrations are remembered as a unified call for democracy, but they emerged from the upheaval of economic change.
The Tiananmen demonstrations came after a period of very rapid reform, and I think that quite a lot of the discontent that was present in society were simple economic issues, such as inequalities in income, inequalities in treatment, and inequality of opportunities that I think a lot of people felt at that time. I was there. I was one of the youngest reporters at Reuters, so my job was to sleep in the square every night. And a lot of the banners that the students were hoisting were not really asking for democracy or a change in political system, They were much more down-home grievances. And I think the Tiananmen democracy demonstrations were built on top of that sort of seething sense of discontent.
The students' cries were soon joined in solidarity by the demands of workers.
Just now, this morning, there is a declaration by the workers. They have established a temporary organization called the Autonomy Association of Workers.
I was a spokesperson of the organization, and then I say, hey, I'm a railway worker, I'm an electrician. And to me, democracy, what is democracy? Is who decide our salary? Actually, I had no idea whether that was democracy or not. But nowadays, I deeply believe, and this is the core of democracy that is built upon if you are able to bargain at workplace, if you are able to elect for your own representatives, and to hold the representatives accountable who are going to be bargained for you on your behalf. That is democracy.
Week after week, as more workers and students joined the protests, the leadership began to fear losing control. On May 20, the government declared martial law and ordered 250,000 troops to enter Beijing.
Around Beijing, tens of thousands of ordinary citizens left their homes to blockade army convoys. Each evening, thousands gathered at major intersections as the blockades went up. The government, meanwhile, was getting desperate. Tanks and armoured vehicles were moved from Mongolia to the edge of Beijing.
I didn't believe there will be a violent clash, because I served in the army for 3 years, and what they insert into my mind is the army served the people, army served the people. I even, on June 3rd, that very evening, late in the evening, people told me they will shoot people, they will do the killing here. I still tell the people in my organizations that I don't believe in it. And I told people I want to lay down and sleep for a little bit. I was really tired. I did fall into sleep in a tent in our headquarters in the corner of Tiananmen Square. All of a sudden, someone woke me up. They said, they're here.
On the night of June 3rd, 1989, tanks and armed soldiers of the People's Liberation Army rolled into Beijing to disperse the protesters by force. Amidst the chaos, some of the protest leaders were helped to escape.
There was a group of young people. They just grabbed me and took me out of the square. And on the way, we saw the tank was burned. We saw people were throwing fire, and the bullets continued. And when they took me out, they left me there, said, go. Anywhere you want to go, run. We have other people to save.
Estimates of the death toll that night vary, from a few hundred to several thousand. But the crackdown didn't end when the square was cleared.
I remember I was sleeping in different fields, and I tell people what happened in Beijing. And all of a sudden, I saw my picture
6月14号
on TV.
韩东方，男，26岁。
I became a wanted person, and the posters in the corner of the streets, and I was on my bike, said, wow, this is really happening. And I ride my bike back to Beijing in front of the gates of Beijing police headquarters and say, here I am. Now you want me, I'm here.
Han Dongfang's prominence in the front line of protest led to a most wanted search for him by the secret police. He handed himself in before they could find him, only to languish without trial in a Beijing jail for 2 years.
In the aftermath of 1989, hardliners in the party reasserted state control of the economy. Growth slowed from double digits to a crawl. It seemed that Deng Xiaoping's agenda of reform and opening up had become another casualty of the crackdown.
Deng effectively is forced into a massive retreat. He was blamed in many respects, or his opponents tried to blame him for what had happened. So to survive, he put economic reform to the side for a couple of years and agreed to retighten political control inside China to prevent something like this happening again.
After this period of complete lockdown, complete political repression, Deng Xiaoping really came to realize that they need to keep the engines of growth going. That really, again, China had no choice. It needed to try to enrich its economy. The memories of the dire poverty of the late 1970s are still fresh. They desperately needed to push forward with economic reform. It's a famous passage of Chinese history now, but Deng Xiaoping went down to the south of China, to Shenzhen, Special Economic Zone, and he did what's called the Southern Tour, in which he engaged with people and told them to be a little more daring and a little faster in the reforms that they're pushing forward. And as they say, the rest is history. The economy just took off. There was a huge amount of foreign investment that came in to build factories all up and down the Chinese coast. And this really grabbed the attention of the world.
There was this sense of the new gold rush, but in reverse, like we were rushing in there. And there was this sense that fortunes could be made overnight, that there were billions of dollars worth of deals on the table ready to go. The opportunities just seemed endless. It was like the Wild West.
Foreign business flocked to China in the early 1990s. Drawn in by the tractor beam of cheap labour, lax regulation, and the chance to make a killing. China's annual growth shot back up to 13% in 1993. In the same year, foreign investment grew by 150%. An export manufacturing boom, concentrated in the special economic zones and coastal cities, was reconfiguring the global economy and transforming the lives of hundreds of millions of Chinese.
I remember in the mid-90s, I got a chance to actually go see a couple of factories set up by some Taiwanese businessmen. And, you know, it's just rows of female workers, all coming from out of town, working in very poor conditions, enduring incredibly long hours. But, you know, that's their hope for a better life. they're still making much, much more than a lot of their peers who stayed in their hometowns doing the farm work. So that's the draw for the armies of migrant workers from inland China to coastal provinces. You're sending money back home, you're able to support the entire family.
寄去的那些钱，他们做什么用？就是家里种田啊，买那些肥料啊，还有我弟弟妹妹读书。
There was this unending amount of labor that were willing to come to factories and work by our comparisons for almost nothing. The labor costs were so tiny. At the brush factory where we filmed, you can see girls trimming the brushes. And when I asked the owner how much per brush does that cost, he couldn't calculate it.
China's manufacturing boom was driving what would become the largest human migration in history. And an equally massive boom in urbanisation. Whole cities grew out of rice paddies and riverbanks as though overnight.
The development was happening so fast. There was this rush, stampede over regulation. Fire protections, security, workers' safety were trodden down. There were explosions in chemical factories. There were fires. We were able to film an interview with two girls who had survived a fire in a raincoat factory.
因为老板他为了干掉，反正他不把我们工人放在眼里，他为了赶货，为了他自己赚钱，所以他是要我们这样跟他卖力。
They slept upstairs in the dormitories, and the factory would run through the night. And when a fire broke out, they were trapped upstairs.
就是烟熏得不得了，就跑到窗口去透气。就是很多人都去那里呼吸外面的空气，里面就是烟。很多人推挤的，就把我给推下去了。啊，你是被推下去的？推下去以后，我就什么也不知道，当时就什么也不知道。后来就是，被火烤醒了我，我就觉得很疼。我就想叫人，人家也不敢近前，就是我的身后就是大火冲天的，人家都不敢近前，我那当时就急得直哭，哭着又昏迷过去。
The girls' story was heartbreaking. They were only in their 20s, and they couldn't go home to their rural family who couldn't afford to keep them. They would have been a burden. So they were stuck for the rest of their lives, living in this prison, really, supported meagerly by the local government. All of our labour regulations in the West had come in trying to prevent exactly this. And there were we and everybody else in the West rushing to take advantage of it.
Open and reform an exciting China. Cheap labor, not only cheap, but no rights whatsoever. Because money is involved. If you put in money to improve the equipment, the business don't want to. The government doesn't care because everything is about efficiency, everything is about money. Money is everything. Money overcomes life, and life is put at the very bottom.
that kind of story wasn't exception. It actually happened. But still, you see people moving to coastal areas, trying to earn factory jobs. The hunger for a better life was so huge that they were willing to take enormous risks and make enormous sacrifices.
For every tragedy, there were many more success stories. In a nation founded on state control of the economy, the newfound freedom to take risks, to choose your job, or even start your own business was truly revolutionary. By the end of the 1990s, 200 million people had lifted themselves out of poverty. But there were still hundreds of millions more waiting for their chance. China's economic engine was hungry for fuel.
In the Yangtze River Valley, China's modern-day Great Wall. It's a dam that will dwarf any other in the world. The size and scale are breathtaking. 7 years in, 10,000 workers will toil for another decade before the monumental Three Gorges scheme is complete.
In 1997, over 1,000 kilometres inland from China's prosperous coastal cities, the flanks of the Three Gorges Dam were joined, completing Phase 1 in the construction of the world's largest power station.
The Three Gorges hydropower dam was actually a long and cherished dream of the Chinese people. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Chinese Republic, dreamt of using the sinew of this Yangtze River to power China's modernization.
The Three Gorges Dam is dizzying in scale. Well over 2 kilometres wide, its design called for 28 million cubic tonnes of concrete. Once filled, its reservoir would cover more than 1,000 square kilometres, displacing over 1 million people and drowning cities, towns and villages with 42 billion tonnes of water. A mass so great, it would slow the rotation of the Earth.
It showed that China could move mountains. The country that built the Great Wall could really apply that level of determination and that level of ambition to its own industrialization. The other aspect was that it signaled that the Chinese developmental model was not going to be just a coastal phenomenon, that cities right in the middle of the Chinese heartland would also develop very quickly. And I think the main example of this is Chongqing.
At the farthest reach of the reservoir was the hulking industrial relic of Chongqing. In 1997, the city had been marked as the next economic centre of China. Its development placed under the direct administration of the government in Beijing. That put it at the heart of an economic reform that China's leaders had avoided for 20 years. The restructuring of state-owned enterprises.
One of the reasons that reforming these state-owned companies was so difficult was that different political leaders in China presided over sectors of the state economy and would put their people in there. In other words, they were bastions of political power. And so you can't simply toss these industries out and privatise them overnight without it having massive political ramifications. And the second thing, at the same time, you had hundreds of millions of workers who all had a guaranteed lifetime job, lifetime income, health, education, pensions, all provided within the walls of a single company. Now, by the end of the 90s, this was no longer tenable.
In 1997, there were 262,000 state-owned enterprises in China. In Chongqing and other cities, at least 2/3 of them were running at a loss, kept above water only by massive state loans. Vested interests and the socialist promise of a job for life, the Iron Rice Bowl, meant millions of workers were being paid to produce a surplus of inferior products that the market didn't even want. Something had to give. And the man to give it was Zhu Rongji.
People in China and even in some Western countries have called Zhu Rongji Boss Zhu, or Zhu Laoban in Chinese, because he's just such a strong-willed leader. During the Cultural Revolution, Zhu Rongji was banished to countryside for hard labor because he was labeled as a capitalist. And then after Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping came to power, and he looked around and told his underlings, gee, we really do not have too many people in the party who understand the economy, but Zhu Rongji is someone who does.
Before Deng Xiaoping died in 1997, he anointed Zhu Rongji as premier to continue his crusade of market reform. Boss Zhu didn't hold back. In 1998, he took a cleaver to the bloated state sector, slashing loans and allowing thousands of inefficient state companies to fail. Over a period of 5 years, 35 million workers lost their jobs.
Two things were happening here. The first thing, Zhu Rongji didn't want to get rid of the state sector, he wanted to make it stronger and viable. This is where people misunderstand what he did. He was not doing privatisation, he was trimming the sector down so that it could survive and prosper. He was also creating a bigger private economy because there was going to be more room for entrepreneurs. In fact, there had to be more room for entrepreneurs to soak up all that labour which had been laid off.
It was called breaking the Iron Rice Bowls.
Han Dongfang
has already spent nearly 2 years in a Chinese jail. His crime was to establish a free trade union. Today, his message is the same, encouraging workers to speak out.
四川省江油市长城特殊钢铁厂有近3万人10个月没有发工资。
Someone worked for 20 years, and even 30 years, and now approach already a few years left toward retirement, and you're told you're laid off. And you end up with nothing but your health damage, your age.
I was in Shanghai writing for the state-owned newspaper. I spent a lot of my time interviewing laid-off textile workers. You know, I could really feel their resentment toward the government at the time because they were middle-aged. They had a whole family to try to support. Who would hire middle-aged, laid-off women from a textile plant who had no other skills?
Zhu Rongji's reforms were devastatingly effective. By 2007, the number of state-owned enterprises had been slashed by more than half, but their combined income was 22 times greater. The fallout was millions more left jobless each year. In the former industrial powerhouse of Shenyang, a factory that once employed 20,000 people, in 2003 employed just 200 workers who were demolishing it for scrap. Those who'd come to Shenyang seeking the bounty of its glory days now watched over a ghost town.
不可想象了，对吧？因为现在的年轻人特别的多，都是下岗的，都是来家待着的。你工厂开不出工资，下岗，对不对？是两极分化，就穷的太穷了，富的太富了。 普通的咱们说的现在就说老百姓吧，对这个社会、对这个国家有不满。
The number of protests in China exploded in the 2000s. The Ministry of Public Security called them mass incidents, a catch-all label for everything from strikes against withheld wages to disputes over government land seizures.
The period of the early 2000s was a really rocky one for major aspects of China's economic reform process. This type of bruising Chinese reform at that time led to thousands and thousands of these so-called mass incidents that were calculated by the Chinese government. By the middle of the 2000s, there was in excess of about 80,000 of these mass incidents across the country each year. People talk about the seamless nature of China's rise, but actually inside the cauldron, it was very painful for a lot of people.
It's often said that after the Tiananmen Square crackdown, an unspoken pact was struck between the Chinese people and their leaders. The government would deliver an ever-improving economy, and the people wouldn't pour back onto the streets to protest. And yet, the government's own records, which it published between 1993 and 2005, show that the number of mass incidents increased every year within that period. Growth, it seems, placated some, but for others, it was an incitement.
Chinese people never stop voice out social justice. And when you voice out these wrongdoing and the police come, put you into prison. This regime, they want to make people happy. So therefore they can stay in power forever, but they just don't know how to. And they pick the wrong way, and they think of making people happy by shut their mouth up. They think if you shut up those people talk about the problem, that equals the problem disappearing. Basically, they hate mirrors, and they want to destroy every mirror so they don't see themselves.
China's leaders do not publicly reflect on or commemorate the launch of the Great Leap Forward in 1958, Mao's utopian vision for economic transformation. But if they did, on its 50th anniversary in 2008, how might they have rated the nation's progress? There was no famine anymore. Less than 8% of Chinese lived below the poverty line. Mass steel production, one of Mao's chief goals in the Great Leap Forward, had become a Chinese trademark. They produced over a third of global output. Instead of tractors, Chinese factories made consumer products, increasingly for the domestic market. There was a growing middle class.
我们也是为了他们更好的有活动的空间，所以才买了这新的房子。原来的房子比这个要小一些。
The creative disobedience of millions of entrepreneurs had created a dynamic private sector. It accounted for about 2/3 of national GDP. The children of the nouveau riche, the so-called Fuerdai, were the first generation of Chinese to have known nothing but wealth their whole lives. The armies of peasants were still there, but they were no longer working on communes.
向前看。
Around 150 million of them had left their farms and families to find work in the world's factory.
今年全球性的经济危机造成农民工今年就业的困难。
Like the rest of the world, China was facing the global financial crisis. Unlike most Western countries, China would not go into recession, as it pumped almost $600 billion of state loans into infrastructure and development, boosting demand for raw materials right when the world needed it.
China saved the global economy at that time. It was Chinese demand driven by this enormous outpouring of building that saved the global economy from the rocks in 2009 and subsequently in 2010. So this was a key moment in global economic history. And sure enough, the results of this were going to really stun the world.
As the world licked its wounds after the global financial crisis, many observers were stunned by China's relentless rise. They puzzled over how it was that China seemed to have triumphed where other former socialist states had faltered, combining the freedoms of the open market with the strong arm of centralized control. In grappling for an explanation, many have described China's achievement as a miracle.
China miracle does exist. It did happen. We cannot ignore that. But the miracle was built on the blood and life of Chinese workers. There's a deal of money and power, a perfect marriage, evil perfect marriage of communism and capitalism when they matched together and created something wow.
Many Chinese are increasingly confident that they do have a unique model. It's not Western, it's not even Asian, it's uniquely Chinese. It blends the market, it blends with China's own sort of history, that is bureaucratic history, and it obviously blends in with Communist Party, single-party rule. Maybe it will collapse under the weight of its own contradictions at some stage, but that hasn't happened yet. That model has done much, much better than most in the West and that many in China ever thought it would.
The leadership would ask, what's wrong with our model? It's just the right model for us. China has survived one crisis after another, right? Global financial crisis was one. The trade war with the US is another one. And most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. China's economy is still growing. But on the other hand, I think the apparent successes really led to a big sense of hubris in China, in Beijing. So what followed was even greater state intervention in the economic system. These days, under President Xi Jinping, you see government is getting more involved in business decisions, even private companies. Many private bosses are getting afraid of, their rights not being protected by the government, their wealth getting taken away by the government. So they are less incentivized to invest, expand, and innovate.
Many people have predicted that the Chinese economy is going to collapse, that it's growing far too fast, that it's got a big debt problem, that it's got all kinds of other problems that are going to bring the juggernaut to a shuddering halt. But that's never been my perspective until now, we have under Xi Jinping undoubtedly seen closing down of entrepreneurial energies. Those are the energies that come from creative disobedience, from the gray areas. The private enterprises in China started in a gray area. Under the new vision of Xi Jinping thought as it applies to the economy, you will have a state-dominated economic system plus a kind of digital Leninism in which everybody's surveilled. The actions of every person is clear. This kind of vision could end up suffocating some of the very creative energies that have driven China forward, and it could end up killing the golden goose that laid the eggs.
Next time, in the China Century, the unresolved mission to unify the motherland.
你不懂中国的历史，你不知道中国人民一定会以鲜血和生命来捍卫祖国的统一、民族的尊严。